If you work a lot with pivot tables, which I know that you do, then in this video, I want to take your pivot tables from looking like this to looking like this. Let's start. All right, I'm in Excel. Let's just start with the data that I'm working with, which eventually is going to build out that nice little pivot table that we took a look at. So here we have the sales table with a standard few columns: transaction, date, region, product, units, and then the channel that we sold in. And on the right hand side, we have the products table. That means that any particular product, if you want to find out more dimensions of that product, you would eventually have to write a VLOOKUP into this table and get the columns in this particular table. Now we'll see how do we deal with that, but this is the table, the two tables that I'm working with at the moment. And using this, I have to kind of make a pivot table which describes the following. So if you take a look at the pivot table, that was the bad looking pivot table that I have made here, which is where I want to take a look at in the year, in the month of January, what was the product level performance. And here are all the products that I have, and I want to take a look at a couple of metrics for those products. So I want to take a look at region by region. So here are my regions. I want to take a look at region by region. What was the sales of the products? What is the YTD of those products? How many units did I sell? And things like that. And if you take a look at this particular pivot table, there's nothing bad in this pivot table. It's just that it's a little too much to read and it's not insightful at all. To be able to take this pivot table and make it something like this, which is where you can slice and dice the data and even take a look at different years and things like that, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create this entire pivot table exercise into three different parts. The first part of this video is going to be that how do I set up the model, the data that we took a look at, how do we take that data into Power Pivot, not a regular pivot table, how do we set up a model behind that. The second part is going to be about calculations. How do we write different calculations that we need? Not only the calculations that we took a look at in the pivot table, but also a few enhanced calculations, which is going to lift up the insights in the pivot table that we see. And finally, the part that you like, which is nothing but beautifying and formatting the pivot table so that it looks very, very presentable, nothing short of a dashboard per se. All right, I'm in Excel and that's where I have the data. Let's just take this data from Excel to Power Query. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the data and click on the data tab right here and then click on from table range. And that will take my first table into Power Query. Similarly, I'll come to the second table and also click on from table range once again, and that will take the second table also inside of Power Query. In Power Query, when the two tables are loaded, the sales and the products table, they are going to look something like this. I don't want to do any particular transformations to these tables. These tables contain the clean data, and at the moment these tables are coming off from the current Excel file, but sure enough, these tables could be coming from any Excel file, multiple Excel files, CSVs, whatever that might be. I'm just trying to consolidate the data and bring it into Power Query. From here, we push the data into Power Pivot. But before I do that, what I also want to do is I also want to build a calendar table, which is going to give me the access to all the year and the quarter and the month selections and slicing that I might want to do. So I've already built the calendar table. Should you want, you can take the file and get the code, but this is pretty much what my calendar table looks like. I have two variables at the start of the calendar table, which is the start. Here I can pick up whatever start date that I want. Currently it's 1st of January 2011 based on my data. And the end date is 31st of December 2012. And if you take a look at the last step in Power Query, I get a couple of columns. I get the date column, the month column, the index column, the quarter column, and the year column. Now, once this particular table has been set up, now what we're going to do is we're going to click on the Home tab, click on Close and Load, and bring this data into Power Pivot, not in Excel, but Power Pivot. And the option to do that is by clicking on Close and Load to. Right now, this is not highlighted because I have already loaded the data into Power Pivot, but in case you're doing it for the first time, you are going to see this particular option. Once you click on Close and Load to, a window like this is going to appear, which is where it's going to ask you, hey, do you only want to make a connection? Sure enough, I only want to make a connection. I don't really want to load the data into Excel. And the second thing is that sure enough, I want to load this data into data model, which is a fancy way of saying load the data into Power Pivot. Once you click on OK, this is going to put the data, all of the tables that you have, which is sales, products, and the calendar table, up in Power Pivot. Now, in the tab right here, let's just click on the Power Pivot tab, click on Manage, and that's where I can take a look at my tables. Now, there are two views right here, which is the data view, which is where you can take a look at the data, and there is a diagram view, which is where you can take a look at the tables. Now, as a step up, I have already connected the tables by one another using relationships, but in case you see that the tables are not connected with one another, you will then have to build the relationships. Now, take a look. The products table is my dimension table. My calendar is also my dimension table, which is going to link to my sales table. How do we build that relationship? All that I'm going to do is take the product code right here, drag that on top of the product ID, and you will see this particular line created. And the similar thing is I'm going to do it with this table, take the date here and link that with my date right here. So I'll just drag it and drop it on top of this, and this is actually going to form this particular relationship. Now, once the relationships are set, this is the time we go ahead and start to build a very vanilla pivot table and also start to write a few calculations which are going to prove very, very insightful. All right, from here, let's just start or fire up a pivot table. So I'm in the Power Pivot window, and from here, I will start to initiate a pivot table, not from Excel. So I'll actually go right here up on the top, and you can see that we have a pivot table sign right here. Click on that, and I'm going to make a pivot table on a new worksheet. That's all right. And the pivot table window looks something like this. Now, the difference between Excel pivot table and a Power Pivot pivot table is that you get the full scale of the data model. What do I mean by that? Take a look. Generally speaking, when you're working with an Excel pivot table, you don't get to see multiple tables being consolidated into one pivot table structure, and that is one of the finest benefits of using a pivot table by Power Pivot. So you can see that I not only have my sales table and all the columns of it, I have the products table which is linked to my sales table, and I have the calendar table which is also linked to my sales table. Now, let's just make a more manageable pivot table by just dragging and dropping the columns, and let's just also start to create a few calculations. To start off my pivot table, what I would want is the region column off from my sales table. So I'll click on the sales right here. I'll go onto the region column. I'll drag it right here, and I have the region. Next to the region, I would want to have the months column. So I'll just add the months column right here, and we have all the months. For now, we'll just be working with these two columns, but let's just start to do a few calculations against it. The very first calculation that I want to do in this particular pivot table is nothing but my total sales calculation. That means that against the region, against the month, what has been the total sales of that particular region and the month? How do I do that? If you go back for a quick second and take a look at our data, you're going to see that we did not have our sales built into our data. So here is our data. You're going to see that sure enough, we have number of units sold, but we don't have how much sales did we make. Now, in order for me to get the sales, what I need to do is I need to write a VLOOKUP here. And in that VLOOKUP, I need to fetch the price for this particular product from this table right here. Where is the price? Here is the price. I need to fetch this particular price value, and I want to put this price value in this particular column. Once I get both the units and the price, then I want to sum these values up. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do a row by row VLOOKUP and then multiply that VLOOKUP's answer to my units and then sum all the values up. Now, this is a classic example of a row-based calculation, and you will have to use DAX formulas to be able to do that. Sure enough, you can add a column here to do that using a VLOOKUP, but hey, what's the point of using Power Pivot if you're not using DAX formulas? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a quick measure. That's what you call a calculation in Power Pivot. So I'll click on add measure. I've already done that, but I'm going to do that real quick once again. So the first thing that you do is define the measure's name. So I'm just going to call this as TS for total sales. And then I'm going to write a very simple SUMX function here. That SUMX function allows you to go row by row. So I want to step inside every single row of the sales table. And in every single row of the sales table, I want to do a VLOOKUP. So let's just zoom this a bit. So I want to do a VLOOKUP, and for which I will write the related function, which is synonymous to VLOOKUP. And I'll say that, hey, in the VLOOKUP, I want to get the price column from the products table. So just press enter. It just keeps getting smaller again and again. And this particular price is then going to be multiplied with the sales table and the units column, and that's going to be it. And I'm going to close the bracket. You can see that it allows me to check my DAX formula. My DAX formula has no errors. I can even define what data type is it, this is going to be a number, this is going to be a currency with a decimal, single decimal, and things like that. So I can just define this is going to be a currency. I can set this up to US dollar with a 1 decimal or a no decimal, and I'm going to click on OK. Now, once you click on OK, this particular TS calculation will start to show up in your pivot table. It has already started to show in my pivot table because I've already done that. I'm going to cancel this, not commit to this, and start to show you my calculation. So if I click right here, this is where I have my total sales, which is right here. If I click on edit measure, just click on it. In the Power Pivot, I can just click on measures, and I can click on manage measures, and that is my total sales calculation. Click on edit, and you can see that I have the very formula that I just spoke about. Sales units multiplied by the price, and that is set to English US with no decimals. Click on OK. Now, once you have this particular calculation, you can obviously drag this calculation in the value section, and you're going to start to see the results in your pivot table. That's awesome. The next thing that I want to do is I want to start to calculate year-on-year growth. That what is my year-on-year growth for all the products and the months. So essentially, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to compare that this January versus the last January, how much was the growth. I don't want to compare Mumbai to Bangalore. I want to compare Mumbai to Mumbai versus current year versus the last year. So to be able to do that, let's just for a quick second also get the year column from the calendar table. So from the calendar table, I'm gonna take the year, put that in the columns right here, and I have 2 years of data. So I'm trying to compare for the region of Bangalore, 67 with 323. I want to find out that what is the year-on-year growth. To do that, I have already written a year-on-year growth formula using DAX formula language, and that is how the formula looks like. So I'll just go back to my Power Pivot, click on measures, click on manage measures. I've already done that, sales year-on-year, click on edit, and that is what my formula looks like. I'm just going to zoom in a bit and try to explain you the formula real quick. So the first thing is I declare a variable current year, which is where my current year sales numbers are presented right here. Then I calculate what is my last year number using the formula same period last year. Then I calculate growth. So that means if both the current year and the last year numbers are present, then take the current year divided by the last year minus 1, and I return the growth value. And I mark this as a percentage and click on OK. And this is going to start to show up in my pivot table once I drag that. So year on year, once dragged it to the pivot table, it starts to show me that as compared to the last year, there has been 381% growth when 67 is compared with 323. Quick interruption in the video in case you do not understand what the heck I'm talking about when I'm speaking about DAX functions. DAX is nothing but data analysis expressions. It is the language of Power BI when you have to write formulas, and it is also the language of Power Pivot in case you want to make these powerful calculations. I have a full-fledged DAX and data modeling course, which is where I start absolutely from scratch, and then I build your level to start to solve more difficult, more sophisticated problems, explain everything to you in a structured manner so that you are able to solve very difficult problems of your own data. In case you're interested, the link of the course is down in the description of the video. Let's just get back to the video. All right, once we have calculated my year-on-year growth, let me just kind of go ahead and put the year aside. I don't really want to have the year. Rather, I would want to have a slicer from the year. So I can just maybe go ahead and move this calculation out, move the year out for just a quick second, and add a slicer to the year. So I'll right click on the year and add a slicer, and that's where I add a slicer. And now I can pick up 2012 right here, and I can also add my year-on-year calculation in my pivot table. So I'm going to take my year-on-year calculation, put that in the value section, and that's where I get the same answer. Now 2012 is by default selected. That is being compared to 2011. Let's also calculate another metric, which is YTD, which is very, very simple. Again, in Power Pivot, I'm going to show you the calculation. So measures, manage measures, and that is my YTD. Click on edit, and that's where I have a very, very simple if total YTD calculation. So all that I'm doing is calculating my YTD sales for total sales, and my calendar date column is already present. I've marked that as a $sign with no decimals. Click on OK, and that calculation now starts to show in my pivot table once I drag on top of that, and that's my sales YTD. One last thing, which is nothing but total units. If you remember, the total units was already there as a column in my sales table, so nothing complicated. It's just going to be a sum of the units column in the sales table, and that is exactly what I have done. If you take a look at that particular measure, total units, edit that measure, and that is nothing but the units column totaled up using the sum function. Again, mark it as a whole number, click on OK, and that's a good practice. And then once I drag that, it starts to show up like this. All right, once we have set up the calculations, whether you're building these calculations in Excel or you're building these calculations in Power Pivot, how do you beautify your pivot table to make it look very sophisticated and near replica of a dashboard? Let's just fire up some very interesting formatting tricks. Now comes the design. I love and I hate the design. I love it because it looks beautiful, it creates an impact, and people are able to take a look at your insights very, very easily. I hate it because it's a lot of work and a lot of clicks, but all worth it. Let's start. So the very first thing that I want to do is that I want to modify the headers of how my pivot table looks. So if you actually take a look at my fully fledged ticked and tied pivot table, you're going to see that the headers don't quite look like the headers of a regular pivot table. They look different. How did I do it? Well, actually, I just played a trick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe go ahead and say equals to and refer to the headers right here. Press enter and drag this on the right. Now this is just a replica of whatever the pivot table header is. So should you want to change any particular field, because this cell is linked to this cell, it's automatically going to change it. But now I'm just going to hide this particular row. The shortcut that I use to do that is Control-9, and this particular row is hidden. Now you can format this particular column or this particular row any way that you like, and the filters that you had initially are also not going to bother you that much. So I'm just going to click right here, Control-9, and they are gone. The next thing that I typically do is that I use a very clean layout for my pivot table. Now by default, if you click on the pivot table, you have a lot of designs, and I try not to pick up some heavy designs like this or like this. I try to go for absolute minimal or no layout. Which is the one right up on the top, which is none. This is the one that I typically choose in my pivot tables because it's neat, it's clean, it's minimal. The second thing that I end up doing is that I almost always in the report layout choose the tabular form so that I get individual columns for every single dimension that I have. The first dimension here is nothing but the region, the second dimension is nothing but the month, and I get two different columns for that. That's very, very easy to read. So show tabular form is another thing that I do. Then I tend to decide that what is the level of grand totals do I want? Do I want to have subtotals here? Do I want to have subtotals here? Do I want to have subtotals at the end of the pivot table? Do I want to have grand totals here? Things like that. So I tend to pick up the grand totals and subtotals depending upon how much detail do I want to show. But for now, I definitely want to have the total of the entire region, but not the total for the entire pivot table. So I'm going to go over to the design tab. In the subtotals right here, I'm going to say show it at the bottom of the group, so I get to see how much is the total for Bangalore, and that is nice. But I don't really want to have the grand total because it doesn't make sense. So I can just right click on the grand total and I can say remove the grand total. So I get this total, but I do not kind of get the grand total, and that's totally all right with me. Now I can just expand on this column a bit, decide on what is the column width that I want. Once I have decided what is the column width that I want, I don't want my pivot table to keep changing the width of the columns. It is so freaking annoying. How do I do that? I'm just going to right click on the pivot table and then go over to pivot table options, and that is where I have this option called auto fit column width on update. I hate it. I'm just going to maybe uncheck it and not let the columns shift in widths once my pivot table changes, although it's not going to change, but hey, I don't really want to do that. I click on OK, and the pivot table is just going to stay like the way it is. The next big thing that move the needle in terms of design on your dashboard or your pivot table is nothing but slicers. Now, sure enough, this slicer is okay, it's generic, but it's not classy, it's not sophisticated. So in order to make the slicer sophisticated, let's just add one more slicer. So I'm just going to right click on the pivot table, show the field list, and I'm going to add a slicer for the product name as well. So in my products table, I have the name of the product right here, right click, and I'll add a slicer, and that slicer looks something like this, which is where all the products are selected. Now, no problem, this is all good, looks good as well, but it's generic. Now what you can do is you can click on the slicer, go to the slicer, and whatever slicer is selected by default right here, you can duplicate it and you can start modifying the slicer. Let me show you by an example. So I click on the slicer, and let's just say this is my standard slicer. I can right click on it, I can duplicate it and call this as my test. And now I can start to format every single element of the slicer. So be it the header of the slicer, we have an option for headers. Sorry, the whole slicer. This is the whole slicer actually. This one is the whole slicer. You can format that. You can format the header, which is here. You can format the item selected with data, item selected without data, and a whole lot of these options. So you can individually go and pick up every single format or element of the slicer, click on the format, and you can format howsoever the way that you like. The only problem, it is very, very time consuming. So, well, I'm going to help you out. So let's just say that if you like somebody's slicer, you're taking a look at somebody's dashboard, you're taking a look at somebody's nice report, and they have used Excel slicers and you like it. If you can get a hang of their Excel file with the slicers built in, you can literally copy and paste the design. Well, how? Take a look. So on sheet number 2, which is where I have my dashboard, I built the slicers like this. You can see that it looks much better with all of these hovering effect and things like that. I want to have this slicer copied to my current dashboard. Now, once you get the hold of this particular file that I will obviously share with you, you can actually go ahead and copy this particular slicer onto your own Excel file, which is where you're working, and then paste the slicer. So I'm just going to say Control C, assuming this is my file, I will paste the slicer right here. Now, once you paste the slicer, what you're also going to get in the slicer is the design pattern. You're going to see that you have a new design created, and now you can just delete the slicer and then take this design and apply it to your own slicer, and voila, it's just going to work. So I'm going to get rid of the slicer right here. I've already got the design right here, and I'm just going to click on it right here, and the design just changes magically, and you're just saved from the 1000 clicks that I've already made. You're welcome. So my slicer 1 is done. What about the second slicer? Now, the very first thing that I want to do is that I want to make it horizontal, not really vertical, but I want to make it horizontal. So I'm going to do two things. One is that I've already made the design for that, and I believe that is the one, that's the one. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to change the column width from 1 to 2, and I want to have both of these in the same column width. You can also change it to 3 in case you have the third here, but for now this is kind of good to go. And this is what my slicer looks like, and I'm just going to put it right up on the top. At the moment, everything looks scattered on my dashboard, so I'm going to try to make it more visually appealing and try to make it in a dashboard in a nice layout. So to start with, I don't really want the grid lines right here. I use the shortcut Alt-W VG, and that is going to take off the grid lines. And I'm also going to increase the width of the first two rows right here. So I use the shortcut Alt-HOW, which is going to give me the flexibility to adjust the width. Let's just say both of them are going to be 20. Sorry, Alt-HOW is for the width of the cell. I believe the shortcut for the row height is Alt-HOH, and that is going to be 30, and that is going to increase the row height. Let's just remove one row. I think one row is good enough, and that is pretty good to go. And obviously this is going to be squeezed down to, let's say, 0.5, and that column is an out right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and zoom out a little bit and start to put my slicer right up on the top. So I think we will need a little more height, so I'm just going to use the shortcut Alt-HOH and maybe double that up to, let's say, 60. And that's where I will start to write my title. So sales dashboard, sales performance dashboard, press enter. I'm going to middle align this and also increase the font size just a little bit. So let's just say that we make this as about 16. This is kind of good to go. And right here, I'm just going to maybe pick up the slicer and put the slicer right here as well, so that I get to see what year is that. Now, what I want to do is I want to build a panel, and the panel is going to contain obviously the title, it's going to contain the slicer, and it's going to contain all of these headers as well. So my panel is going to be for the first two rows. So this is my first row and the second row and all of the columns, and I'm just going to color the panel as gray, which is right here, and this is going to build a nice little panel up on the top, which is where I have the title of the dashboard, the headers of my pivot table, and the slicer as well. And sure enough, we can move this particular product slicer also right here so that it adjusts perfectly with the panel up on the top. As an additional thing that we can do in this particular thing is that once you're scrolling down this entire dashboard, the user is going to lose this particular title, is going to lose this particular header of the pivot table. I'm assuming that when you're creating this for your real company, this is going to be a lot of regions, so you might as well want to keep those headers intact. The way to do that is I'm just going to maybe come to, let's say, row number 4 and apply a freeze panes. The shortcut for that is Alt-WFF, and that is now good to go. Now, if somebody scrolls on this, you're going to see that the header of this particular thing and the headers of the pivot table are intact, and they don't lose out on the headers while trying to read the pivot table. All right, next up is conditional formatting, just to enhance the readability of the pivot table. Now, if you're taking a look at all the regions, maybe I want to compare which is the largest month of sales in the entire region that I have. And the simplest way to do that is by creating conditional formatting. I'll show you how. So I click on the cell right here. Then I go over to the home tab and I say conditional formatting, and I'm going to choose the option data bars. I can pick up any particular one. Let's just say that I pick up this particular one. Data bars are applied, and you can see that you have this little icon right here. This icon is the icon that will help you spill the data bar effect to the rest of the cells in the pivot table, no matter how long the pivot table, no matter how long or short the pivot table automatically becomes. This option is going to be dynamic. So I click on this particular option and I choose the last one. All cells showing total sales values for the months. I select that, and it's not going to maybe show up in the total because total is anyways going to be the largest value. And once you have it, obviously sometimes you're going to see that the number actually is behind the color. In case this is intrusive, you can tone down the color of this bar. Let's just also add this for the total units as well. So if I just maybe click on conditional formatting, again go to data bars, but pick up the same color data bar, and again that click button comes right here, and I'm going to click on the total sales units for months, and that is going to show up right here. One additional conditional formatting option that I'd like to do is definitely for sales year on year. Right now it's just a percentage, shows you how much growth or fall that you've had as compared to the previous year. But in case any particular value is negative, where you've taken a hit as compared to the last year, you might want to turn that out in red. Very, very simple. So I just click on the value right here. I go over to the home tab and I click on this conditional formatting, and I say that I would like to highlight the cells which are less than a 0. So I click on 0, and I can just maybe color this as red text, click on OK, and again I'm just going to maybe click right here and show values for the entire data. Now I can just go over to the home tab and click on manage rules right here when this particular cell is selected, and I can take a look at all the rules that I have. Now only for this one I click on edit, and I make sure that that is selecting for the entire thing, and I will also make sure that I color this as bold. So I click on the format right here, and I'm going to say that this is going to be a bold format. Click on OK, apply, OK. This is kind of good to go. Now, if you change this slicer effect, you can see that everywhere where you have a negative is going to start to show in red. One last thing that I would like to do that lifts up the quality of the entire dashboard is by adding KPIs to my dashboard. What are KPIs? KPIs are key performance indicators. Those are like signs that give you red, yellow, or green, that things are working fine or not. These KPIs are inherently available only in Power Pivot unless you want to create these KPIs using formulas in Excel. But please take a look. So I have this pivot table, and I want to say that, hey, my KPI is that every single month the sales should be above $100. Anything less than that is a red sign. So to do that, I have created a KPI. Let me show you how did I do that in the first place. So I click on Power Pivot right here, and I click on KPI, and I've already done the KPI. So I'm going to click on Manage KPIs, and once you click on New KPI, you'll be able to create a new KPI. I'm going to show you the one that I have created. So I have a KPI right here, and I click on Edit, and you can see that this is how the new KPI looks like if you click on the New KPI button. Now, I'm going to say that the absolute target that I have is 100. That's what I have. And this is the range that I have defined. So anything above 95 is going to be colored as green. From 94 to, let's say, 75 is going to be this particular color. Anything less than 75 is going to start to show me red. And I click on OK, and this is kind of good to go. Or maybe I can just even pick up the color that I want, click on OK, close it, and this is good to go. Now, once I start to add that KPI, so if I just show up the field list, you can start to see that I get this particular thing, which is my total sales, and there's a KPI attached to total sales, and I can just drag the status column in my visual, and it'll start to show up something like this. So just have to move the product a bit on the side, and it'll start to show up something like this, which is nothing but my status column. Now, if you are wondering that where is my header, I can just maybe copy this formula onto the right, and you will start to see my header as well. So this is at the moment total sales status. You can also relabel this as status, but hey, this is nothing but the KPI. Just by looking at this, it's very easy to figure out that all of this entire months are red. Here, maybe some months are green, 1 or 2 months are red, and some action needs to be taken here as well. And finally, if you just did a little bit of arranging the stuff, ordering them, aligning them, things like that, this is going to start to look something like this. And this is a pretty awesome design, which is where the user can click on any particular product, they can pick up any particular year, they can take a look at the metrics, and the pivot table is absolutely dynamic and looks incredibly awesome.